In government vaults and classified files, in diplomatic silence and Cold War calculations, the truth of what happened along the Baltic shores between 1918 and 1920 was quietly shelved. For decades, maps were redrawn, histories rewritten, and an entire nation's struggle for existence was reduced to a footnote in the grand narrative of empires rising and falling. But the land remembers. The rivers carry whispers. And now, a century later, the silence breaks. This is the story of Latvia, a nation born in the ashes of the Great War, christened in blood, and forged by the hands of farmers, soldiers, poets, and peasants who refused to vanish from the earth. On the cold dawn of November 18, 1918, the city of Riga stood exhausted. For years of World War had gutted its streets, drained its coffers, scattered its sons across battlefields from Tannenberg to the Carpathians. The German occupation that had clamped down on Latvian soil since 1915 now groaned under the weight of imperial collapse. Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated just days before. The mighty German Empire, once so certain of eternal dominion over these Baltic lands, was hemorrhaging soldiers and authority with every passing hour. And in the vacuum left behind, a fragile dream dared to take shape. That morning, in the auditorium of the Riga Latvian Society, building on Merkla Street, a gathering of politicians, intellectuals, and civic leaders convened under the anxious gaze of history. They called themselves the People's Council, Tautas Padome, a coalition of social democrats, agrarian unionists, and national liberals united by a single, audacious proposition: that the Latvian people, after 7 centuries of foreign rule, would govern themselves. At the center of this assembly stood a man whose name would become synonymous with Latvian statehood, Klis Ulmanis, a 41-year-old agronomist with wire-rimmed spectacles and a voice steady enough to calm hurricanes. The proclamation he read that morning was neither long nor elaborate. It declared the birth of the Republic of Latvia, asserted the sovereignty of its people, and invited the world to witness a nation stepping out of the shadows of empire. The words hung in the cold air of that auditorium like a prayer and a dare. Outside, German soldiers still patrolled the streets. To the east, the chaos of revolutionary Russia churned with violence and ideology. To the west, the victorious Allies redrew maps with little regard for small peoples with ancient tongues. And yet, in that room, for a single suspended moment, hope felt possible. But hope, as the Latvian people would soon learn, was a currency easily spent and difficult to replenish. The Declaration of Independence was not a triumph, it was a gamble. Latvia possessed no standing army, no functioning state apparatus, no international recognition. Its treasury was empty. Its borders were notional lines on maps that foreign powers might or might not choose to respect. The provisional government under Ulmanis controlled little more than the will of its members and the desperate aspirations of a populace weary beyond measure. In the weeks that followed November 18th, the fragile new republic scrambled to conjure institutions from thin air. Ministers were appointed to oversee portfolios that existed only on paper. Decrees were issued in the name of a state that had no means to enforce them. And across the land in Riga's tenements, in the farmsteads of Korzim. In the market squares of Latgale, ordinary Latvians watched and waited, uncertain whether this new beginning was salvation or illusion. The collapse of German authority accelerated through December. Soldiers of the Kaiser's army, demoralized and mutinous, streamed westward in disorganized columns, stripping the countryside of whatever supplies remained. The occupation that had strangled Latvian economic and cultural life for 3 years was ending not with a formal surrender, but with a slow, chaotic unraveling. German commanders, their attention fixed on the revolution consuming their homeland, had little interest in maintaining order in territories they were abandoning. The vacuum they left behind was absolute. And into that vacuum, from the east, came the Bolsheviks. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had unleashed forces that no armistice could contain. By the autumn of 1918, the Bolshevik government in Moscow, led by Vladimir Lenin, had consolidated enough power to turn its attention to the borderlands of the former empire. Latvia, with its strategic ports, its industrialized economy, and its restive working class, was a prize worth seizing. The Soviet leadership believed, not without reason, that revolution would spread westward, that the workers of Europe would rise, and that the Baltic states would serve as stepping stones to a global communist transformation. The instrument of this ambition was the Red Army, and more specifically, the Latvian Riflemen. Here was one of history's bitter ironies. The Latvian Riflemen, Latviešu strelnieki, had been among the most celebrated units of the Russian Imperial Army during the Great War, recruited from Latvian volunteers eager to defend their homeland against German invasion. These regiments had distinguished themselves through extraordinary courage and horrific sacrifice on the Eastern Front. By 1917, their ranks had been decimated, their idealism corroded by the incompetence and betrayal of the Tsarist command. When the revolution came, many of these battle-hardened soldiers, radicalized by suffering, disillusioned with the old order, threw their lot in with the Bolsheviks. They became the Praetorian Guard of the revolution, the shock troops of Lenin's new regime. Now, in the winter of 1918, these same Latvian riflemen marched westward under red banners to liberate the land of their birth, a liberation. That meant the destruction of the very independence their countrymen had just proclaimed. The civilian population of Latvia faced this approaching storm with a mixture of dread and confusion. In the cities, workers who had suffered under German occupation heard Bolshevik promises of land, bread and power with varying degrees of hope and skepticism. In the countryside, peasants who had endured centuries of serfdom under Baltic German landlords viewed the rhetoric of class warfare through the prism of ancient grievances. And everywhere, families who simply wanted peace, who had buried sons in the trenches, who had starved through blockades, who had watched their world collapse, now confronted the prospect of yet another army, yet another ideology, yet another wave of violence washing over their homes. The provisional government under Ulmaneus understood that survival required armed force. But where would such force come from? The new republic had no military tradition of its own. The German occupation had suppressed any independent Latvian military organization. Few trained officers and soldiers available were scattered, disorganized, ideologically divided. Many of the most experienced Latvian fighters were, at that very moment, marching toward Riga under Bolshevik command. In those desperate December days, the call went out for volunteers. And against all rational expectation, they came. They came from farms and factories, from schools and workshops. They came wearing civilian clothes, carrying hunting rifles and family heirlooms, driven by something that transcended military calculation. In Riga, young men who had never held a weapon signed up for units that had no barracks, no uniforms, no chain of command. In the provinces, local patriots formed militia bands with grand names and minimal equipment. The first Latvian national military formation, later dignified with the title of the 1st Independent Battalion, was a patchwork of raw recruits, aging veterans, and idealists held together by little more than shared desperation and a flag. Among those who answered the call was Oskars Kalpaks, a 36-year-old officer who had served with distinction in the Russian Imperial Army before. Returning to his homeland to build something new, Kalpaks was neither a firebrand nor a theorist. He was a professional soldier who understood that nations are defended not by proclamations but by men willing to stand in the line of fire. In the weeks ahead, he would become the first commander of the Latvian National Armed Forces and one of its first martyrs. The mood in Riga, as December wore on, was one of mounting dread. Refugees from the east brought stories of Bolshevik atrocities, summary executions, property seizures, the dismantling of churches and civic institutions. The rhetoric of class warfare translated on the ground into settling old scores with lethal efficiency. The Red Terror was not an abstraction, it was a policy, implemented with systematic brutality in every territory the Bolsheviks conquered. By mid-December, the first engagements had begun. Latvian volunteer units outnumbered, outgunned, barely trained, clashed with advancing Red Army forces along the eastern approaches to Riga. These were not battles in any conventional sense. Were desperate holding actions, delaying tactics, sacrificial gestures that bought hours rather than victories. The provisional government, recognizing the impossibility of defending the capital, began preparations for evacuation. On the streets of Riga, civilians faced impossible choices. Flee westward into the unknown, abandoning homes and livelihoods. Stay in hope that the Bolsheviks would prove merciful. Hide valuables, burn documents, pray for deliverance. The city that had witnessed Latvia's birth now trembled on the edge of its possible death. And then, on the evening of January 2nd, 1919, the sky to the east lit up with artillery fire. The sound of the guns rolled across the frozen Daugava River like the footsteps of some ancient, vengeful god. Soviet forces had reached the outskirts of the city. The final assault was beginning. Reference Burzy, Alfred's. The birth of the Latvian Army. 1918 to 1920. Latvian Academic Library, 1928. That night, as darkness descended over Riga, the streets filled with terror. Families huddled in cellars, listening to the approaching thunder of war. Soldiers who had trained for mere days checked their weapons with trembling hands. And in a cramped government office, Clisomani stared at maps that offered no hope, knowing that the Republic proclaimed just weeks before might not survive to see the dawn. The distant thunder grew louder. Shells began to fall within the city limits. Somewhere a church bell tolled, whether in warning or in mourning, no one could say. The new Republic's fragile dream teetered on the edge of annihilation. As the first red banners appeared on the horizon, Latvia faced a question that would echo through the months of blood and fire to come. Could freedom survive when everything conspired to destroy it? The answer lay somewhere in the frozen darkness ahead, written in courage, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal of a people to disappear.